All right. So welcome everyone to the second of 6 lectures this term as part of University of Minnesota School of Architecture's lecture series. So as I said before, please note that today's lecture will be recorded and posted on the University of Minnesota College of Design's YouTube channel, which you can find at the link that I'll put in the chat just shortly. Also, I encourage people to ask questions in the chat. You can write them in the chat as you think of them, and I'll kind of moderate that for our Q&A at the end of the lecture. But today we're honored to host Jerome Hayford. Jerome is an architect and educator based in Harlem, New York. He is co-founder of the practice Brandt Hayford. And Jerome's work focuses on how architecture establishes a dialogue between contemporary phenomena and non-hegemonic histories, users, and spaces. His writing on archaeology, Blackness, and architectural speculation has been published by many venues, including Log and Project Journals. His collaborative studio, Brandt Hayford, were winners of the first annual 2012 Folly competition held by the Architectural League of New York, and was recently awarded the grand prize for the 2019 Zero Threshold Multi-Abled Housing Competition. The studio is one of the 2020 winners of the AIA New Practices New York Award, and their work has been exhibited widely. Jerome wears many, many hats and is also currently an adjunct professor at Columbia GSAPP, City College Spitzer School of Architecture, and Barnard College. He's also, I'm proud to say, one of the instigators of Dark Matter University, a network of scholars and practitioners working on new models of anti-racist design education. So please join me in welcoming Jerome.
Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. Let me get myself queued up. Okay. And can you all see the slides?
Yes.
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 All right, great. But you don't see me. All right, there I am. Let's hope my poor little computer holds up. Thank you so much for the College of Architecture and Design at University of Minnesota. Jennifer, who's a good friend of mine, for inviting me. I'm really, really thrilled to be here. What a week. Even without what's happening in the world, I think this time of year, early October, late September, it's a lot. And I had that feeling even before we solidified the date. But I'm actually really happy to get a chance to sort of reflect a little bit with you guys today. So I titled this talk, which kind of covers a fair amount of territory, you could say, including the work of my collaborative practice, a geography of practice. And I've given a few talks actually recently, like When It Rains, It Pours. And I thought that I would try to organize my work a little differently than before in this talk. So you guys are kind of guinea pigs, but maybe it's more engaging when it's slightly off the cuff. But I was asked earlier this summer by two curators who actually reached out to me, Laura Fierro and Augustine Mendez of the Americas Society, to sort of characterize my work. And we kind of went back and forth about this idea and ended up really kind of crystallizing around this notion of sort of geography of practice. And I wrote a short kind of accompaniment to this kind of framework that I've been sort of trying to organize my work around, which begins, every generation has to redefine what practice means to them. And this generation is no different. In order to more authentically engage the present, we have to look back and around us. In my case, the concerns of the present create historical and critical linkages. that tie together the geographical locations of a practice. Go to the next. And I thought I would start today by looking at the work of someone like Torkwase Dyson, the mixed media painter, sculptor, who I hear has come to your school and presented her work, so you guys are familiar, and whose work I became aware of a couple years back, and has had a fair amount of impact on my thinking about related ideas that I've been grappling with in architecture and in my sort of practice, capital P, and my teaching. And I think this work, you know, among other things that Torkwase's work affords or gives us is really, I think, new language and dimension. Sorry, my video keeps going out there. Gives new language to some of these persistent themes such as geography, architecture, and abstraction, but really through this lens of Blackness and Black subjectivity, and how we might understand a project of Blackness and that how it adds new layers and concepts to these terms and languages like geography, like architecture, like distance and geometry. And within this kind of theory that Torkwase is sort of working on, which she describes as Black compositional thought, is really premised under this idea that I'm going to try my best to paraphrase here, that you know, really the struggle, the ingenuity and resourcefulness and imagination of Black bodies to self-liberate historically and contemporarily. Oftentimes, while navigating both small and vast distances and territories, can be understood as new kind of concepts and new kinds of formations that are created and articulated in those situations that we can learn from in order to aid in self-liberation. And so in her own words, Torkwase describes Black compositional thought is a working term that considers how paths, throughways, waterways, architecture, objects, and geographies are composed by Black bodies, and how additional properties of energy, space, scale, and sound, right, all work together in networks of liberation. There's a physical material space of composition, and then there's an energetic space of composition. So there's different kinds of space. How do they work together so that Black people use these entities towards liberation? With climate change, we're going to need to understand these histories to deploy a different kind of compositional thought within the current conditions of increasing water levels, of land being continuously exhausted, of climate migration and global warming. She says, my paintings are compositional studies of these systems formed by Black people who've used architecture as a space to self-liberate. And I think that then by extension, all of us can kind of, you know, learn from these new languages. And I've been doing a lot of thinking really on how this can apply on a more maybe meta or autobiographical level towards thinking about the sort of geography or territories that are linked together, in this case, to form a practice. So how the architect almost every generation, as I was saying, has to kind of construct new kinds of not only literal geometry, but also kind of practitional geometry, conceptual geometry, to produce new assemblages and expanded modes of practice, and to expand their own mode of practice. And I think right now this is really an important topic, because we're in this moment where we're really questioning a lot of things and have experienced, you know, a sort of, you know, gradual and then increasing indictment on some of our institutions and disciplinary tools. Including the instrumentality of architecture itself. What is our instrumentality? It's actually the title of the course I'm teaching right now with co-professor Mitchell Squall at City College. And what are the options or agency that you have as an architecture student or a young practitioner or any practitioner in defining an architectural practice? There tends to be this very fixed idea of working in a professional setting on specific kinds of things, but I think it's valuable to confront students, especially with their own imaginative capacity and the urgency to really define and chart your own form of practice out of the tools that are available to you by art discipline. And I think that that's completely valid. So this concept of geography and territory now in its more literal sense is also very important and operative for how I've been thinking about my practice, and it overlaps how we navigate, a literal geography, which I'll get into, and more, as I was saying, professional or social geographies, and how those continue to shape a kind of comprehensive practice. And the notion of territory itself has been a persistent theme in my work and my design partner, Brant Knapp's work. And it's operating always on kind of multiple levels simultaneously as a sort of compositional or maybe aesthetic preoccupation or visual language to work on these ideas, but also as a political and conceptual preoccupation, which is, of course, starts to become very tied to architecture's proximity to history, issues of landedness, property ownership, and of course, this ever-present tension between the individual and the collective. And of course, in this case, I also do want to acknowledge within this context that I'm in New York, currently on the ancestral lands of the Lenape people, and those of you in Minnesota, I want to acknowledge that are on the ancestral land of the Dakota and many other sort of native tribes. So this is another kind of territory map. This is an object, I guess you could say, that we produced in our studio, Brant Hayford, which is really a collective drawing that we co-produced over the course of a couple of weeks with a group of peers as part of a kind of narrative unfolded multidisciplinary project. This appears small, but this was actually this huge canvas of yoga mats, about 6 feet by probably 40 feet if you stretch out the whole thing. And I think this really illustrates an interest that we've had in our practice really since graduate school of territory and negotiated territory, and how to play with that idea and use the medium of design and kind of rescripting the design process to play with issues of like authorship, ownership, and collective production, and how difference can overlay and occupy and negotiate the same geographic territory. So this actually also functioned as a bench as part of this kind of unfolded object. And these are some of the, I'll just scroll very quickly, some of the different designs that our collaborators really contaminated each other's canvas with in the creation of this kind of collective drawing. And so it really bleeds together. And, our kind of agency here was, and we've played around with this idea in different contexts, was really to design a kind of framework or a game that would then allow for, some of this to play out, but the result really was to many degrees unpredictable, which I think, again, is really challenges even our notion of being architects. We like to sort of ensure a kind of desired outcome, but we really we're playing with this idea of, again, negotiated territory. How do we co-produce objects and sort of kind of play with this idea of sort of fixed ownership of space? And the source material for this object really emanated out of our own office space, which is there in East Harlem, shown in the red, where we really take our local territory here of East Harlem, which is near where we both live, as this kind of larger, almost client and impetus for our work and inspiration for a lot of our work. And so again, the space of our studio really was a workshop environment to kind of look at the history of kind of weaving of different practices and kind of do our own take on that sort of process, which again was, the inspiration for these different designs that our collaborators put into the canvas was taken kind of directly from our immediate provincial context here in East Harlem. You can see some of the process there. So this object was unfolded in front of the storefront for art and architecture as part of a performance series, which was really fun. So again, I'm, kind of tracing back. Here's actually a drawing. This is the first, one of the first projects that my collaborator, Brant Knapp, the other half of Brant Hayford, and I did in graduate school, which is to really illustrate that we've been really interested in ideas of kind of territory since the earliest days of our collaboration. This was a project that we worked on in Peter Eisenman's advanced studio, where we were kind of thinking about, this idea at different scales. And so how do you represent different concepts at the scale of, say, the region, in this case of the Veneto, which is where the city of Venice is located, and begin to kind of use that as a sort of transcendent idea that could operate at different scales. Or if you jump much further ahead to a project much later on in our collaboration, but before I guess we opened our office formally, being asked to propose projects for, in this case, a small college in Virginia, where we stumbled upon these kind of historic property owner maps and began to really just kind of do design work, just using these maps, which included also sort of slave quarters on these maps and the residue of multiple farm owners that really started to almost produce an aesthetic by which we would even operate within for that project. So like I was saying, this is our practice. This is the two of us. Sorry, my video is not working. I'm very sad. Don't know how to fix that. Might try to fix it, but it could backfire. Yeah.
Oh, we see you again now.
Oh, it's not working.
If you want to just leave it, if you want to leave it off, that's okay. Maybe turn it on when we do Q&A at the end.
All right, let me see. Let me try to fix it real quick. Sorry, guys.
No problem.
Taking me out of the focus. Just got to re-embody here for a second. Okay, let's see if this works. I think I just have too many tabs open. All right. I'm gonna do that, and then I'm gonna do that.
And we're back. But we still can't see you.
Back. Uh-oh. It's a step-by-step, Jennifer. So, okay, this, then this, and then full screen. Okay. And then let's see if you can see me.
There you go.
Okay, I'm here. Yay! And I'm also on the screen. So this is us. And I just thought I would give a little bit of the background of our collaborative practice and show some of our work. This photo was taken just after we started renting space about 3 years ago here in Harlem. And every office starts very differently and kind of navigates their own professional territory very differently. We really began out as a kind of almost a public art practice, not super unlike Dream the Combine, my host today, and producing, built public work in and around New York City. So that we were really building these full-scale pavilions and public spaces around this kind of, really peripheral hinterland territory geography of New York. Socrates Park in Queens was where the first one that you see here titled Curtain was constructed. And we were really trying to operate within this tension between a kind of highly abstract exercise and one of kind of designing through game playing that's best seen in this line drawing of the project. But at the same time, simultaneously working on these projects, holding the kind of a sort of heavily abstract project, but a very much kind of in the real tactile materiality simultaneously. So while we were working with these different line thicknesses, you could say, we were really thinking about the 4x4 pieces of wood the white chain link material that became the kind of draped curtain over the structure, and the welded steel joints, which were the sort of points in that system. So again, these lines were really being simultaneously conceived of as white chain link, as well as sort of projection lines. And you know, that chain link as something that can be played with, touched, and produce a kind of performativity to the architecture. And we were building these projects. This is still of the first one, Curtain, which was actually a competition. It was the first one we submitted to while we were still working for other offices. We were building these things ourselves. So we were kind of really working with a really intense engagement with this place. We were building the project in the space of the park, really dealing with the messiness and unpredictability of many kinds of users and their engagement with that process. So there was a real kind of intense engagement there with that site, you could say. And really thinking about how the geometry of that project really played with its context. So these are just some of the working drawings of that pavilion. Which became a kind of system that we began to tweak and kind of reproduce. So there was another one that was done in Long Island City a couple years later, called Parting, which took a lot of the same sort of tectonic logic of the first Folly, but then reconfigured around the specificities of that context, which included a kind of path that meandered through that really allowed entry into this private lot during certain times of day. So there was a different kind of status of the ground that this project was sort of engaging. But continuing on this sort of linkage of the geography of the projects, kind of as I was looking back this summer, I started saying, you know, that a geography of practice begins with the most immediate where of one chooses to work. In Harlem, for instance, I developed an intimacy with that territory that inspired writings and a shaping of architecture within this hyperlocal context. So we have, you know, fast forward a few years later, my design partner and I relocated, both of us, to Harlem. And really at that point became kind of, you know, not only architects, cultural producers within that context, but just engaged citizens of that place. I've been there now for almost 7 years. And as we began to develop a relationship to that context, we had this opportunity, another opportunity to produce one of these large public installations, and a rationale within that context, which had to do, which you see the installation there on the right at the top of Harlem's Marcus Garvey Park, which obviously comprises of another large built form, but in this case, at this point, had really this project really involved almost a full advocacy process. We were deeply involved over a period of a couple of years with the community, and the kind of impetus for producing this piece had to do with the removal of a landmark fire watchtower, the Harlem Fire Watchtower, from that large outcropping, which in and of itself, you can see it here, this is called the Acropolis of Marcus Garvey Park here in Harlem, is a kind of fantastic piece of geography. It's this sort of obdurate, rocky form that sort of protrudes up out of the Manhattan schist bedrock into the city, and is the only spot where Fifth Avenue is interrupted. So really creating this sort of break between this part of Harlem and the rest of the city to the south. And so we were fascinated by this just as a topography, as a kind of type of territory, which became very kind of inspirational for us. But also, you know, as I was saying, you can see there in this image that the tower, which is a kind of local landmark, is really in this process of deconstruction at the time, and a lot of anxiety. This was in 2015, was being kind of felt around the community surrounding the impending imminent removal of this kind of landmark that you can see here in another historic image at the top of Marcus Garvey Park, which as a site features, very prominently in, numerous kind of historical moments in Harlem, in particular in the kind of Black empowerment movement of the 60s. But this tower predates all of that, but has been kind of adopted by the community as a sort of landmark, as a kind of lighthouse, you could say. And the New York City Parks Department was removing the tower with, sort of a good intention, a promise to bring it back. But, in these situations, a lot of times communities like Harlem, chronically under-resourced, underprivileged communities become very wary of kind of local and state institutions' promises. So here's a photo you can see here where we began to collaborate with the New York City Parks with a sound and media artist, Jessica Feldman, to think about what could we do? Is there something that could hold the space and draw attention to this kind of really also chronically under-resourced space? You can see it's a very derelict space in this image. And, eventually produced, in a sense, a kind of non-tower. So this is the drawing of the project, which we called Caesura, which means to pause, that kind of hovered and took the rules, some of the kind of geometric principles and architectural principles of that historic technology, and in a way inverted it, queered it, made strange this tower, and actually had to do things very different than what a tower normally does. So it became, in a sense, a kind of amplifier for the community and a kind of registrar of various histories of that site. So the final piece you can see here was primarily made out of steel, but contained a kind of resonating membrane that sort of clad that steel framework, and which is where Jessica Feldman, our collaborator, sort of introduced these vibrating transducers onto that frame, which 24/7 kind of played this soundtrack that emanated from the piece, which included, you can see some of the working drawings here of how we sort of wove those transducers, which work like your eardrum, through the piece. But the piece, it then kind of conjured these histories local to the site, without much, kind of bias or judgment to the kind of context necessarily, or maybe, controversy of some of those figures. So you had Marcus Garvey himself, a famous kind of Black segregationist leader, speeches, excerpts of his speeches. This was right around when the Black Lives Matter movement was first hitting the scene. So there were excerpts, there were kind of drums and chants of the Black Lives Matter protests, which were continued to hear up to this day, that were really just emanating from this project. And I think it kind of held space, literally and sort of, historically for the community. And again, we were really learning as we went with this. There hadn't been a large public art in this park for a very long time. And after this point, there's now a very robust sort of arts program in this part of in this park, I'm happy to say, with large public installations. So back to this territory, kind of coming out of that time in that project, that the park itself really became a kind of impetus for a lot of creative and speculative work. So again, that actual literal territory of the mountain, of the tower, of the symbolic and kind of architectural imaginary that's conjured by that place. We began to, write about this park as a sort of negotiated, contested territory of sort of newcomers to Harlem and sort of longer pre-existing immigrant communities, African-American communities. And so again, these ideas of territory were really sort of fueling almost a literal kind of production of work. And for example, this piece we did for Storefront, which was a souvenir that essentially just literally took the kind of three-dimensional, complex three-dimensional geometry of that Acropolis and reproduced it kind of conceptually at a different scale to sort of see what sort of spatial imaginaries we might kind of glean from this a very sort of nuanced, complex place. There's a picture of the sort of built object there. And so, you know, transitioning to this kind of broader territory of Harlem, still within New York City, around this time, I was sort of slowly becoming aware of another site that would be very influential for me, and then eventually for our practice in Harlem. And again, this kind of, you know, trans-temporal geography, which you can see here in the middle of the screen. It's not too far from the Marcus Garvey Park, which would be just to the left of this map. But this site is the Harlem African Burial Ground site, which I sort of, you know, became aware of through, you know, different people in my sort of sphere, and realized, oh, like I never knew that there was, you know, a burial site over there adjacent to the Harlem River. It's really a nothing space. We ride our bikes by this site when we were coming home from the office. You know, just an infrastructural kind of non-territory. A bus depot for the MTA is currently on top of this site. So, you know, the sort of the erasure of that history in this context and being so proximate to it, literally living on the same block as this site, really started to open up and provoke some soul searching on my part for how, you know, given that this site is a site that's being slated for development, including a living memorial in the city, how does architecture deal with this? And that this is now a couple years ago. I think we're now really in the midst of some of that questioning. But this is the historic map there of Harlem. You can see actually the Acropolis there on the left, which was called Snake Hill. But this is not just a historical interest, which was what really started to be my interest in sites like this, is that, you know, time and Torquace, people like Torquace talk about this, you know, is not necessarily a distancing factor. And in the case of Harlem and the Harlem River, even though it's been the site of sort of literal kind of human violence and also urbanistic violence, the river's been infilled. It's a kind of an ecologically problematic area where oil spills off into the river, and the topography, the sort of natural flow, has been interrupted there. So again, these things that we feel like are so distant in time are actually very much kind of operative today, which became a sort of an interest in this site, which eventually I decided to. So as I was saying, you know, began to think more and more about this site. Was sort of surprised that it didn't seem like that many people were kind of thinking about this in architecture. But there are many folks who were thinking about sites like this and the sort of difficulty of imaging a history that has been erased, and how that becomes just a sort of very urgent and difficult proposition for across the cultural disciplines. So I began to become aware of the work of sort of radical historians, like also a friend of mine, Professor Marisa Fuentes, who works between disciplines of women's studies and history, in this case, to grapple with that same problem. And you know, to paraphrase essentially her process, she states that she had to learn to speak the languages of other disciplines, including law, punishment, architecture, and geography, in order to sort of adequately build a subjectivity of these, in her case, enslaved women in the Caribbean lives, because that subjectivity is simply not present in the archive. And so I began to ask myself, wow, that's a really imaginative, creative project how might we do that in architecture? Do architects, does architecture as a discipline need to begin to, again, produce a different kind of geography, critical geography that pulls new things together, new languages, in order to sort of image that subjectivity within our discipline? So I did some thinking about it, did some writing about this. Also looking at, again, the sort of linkages between a place like Harlem and a broader region that's united by institutions like the Dutch Reformed Church that you see here on the left, who were the sort of parochial stewards of many of these African burial sites, which then kind of stretch up into the Hudson Valley, which is not typically considered a post-slavery landscape, but it very much is. And eventually decided to introduce this site to my students in the studio. So they really, grappled with the idea of a living memorial in this case as urbanism. What does it mean to sort of conflate a kind of urbanism on top of or within this context of a sort of sacred space, which of course on the surface is a very controversial thing to do, but I think actually possesses some really forward-thinking new possibilities for these typologies like the living memorial, and for how and offers really deep fundamental questions for architecture and for urbanism. For example, the site of the actual burial ground itself has been dezoned by the city of New York. So what does it mean to dezone a piece of territory, are some of the things we began to think about in the studio. And this is just a little bit of the work from that studio. And also bringing in, different geographies of constituents. So starting to merge these worlds of kind of stakeholder, local non-architect expert, and architectural expertise. So at the final review for this studio, there were historians. You see Professor Fuentes there. There were the descendant community of the Harlem burial ground site. You see there the Reverend Patricia Singletary, and of course, the usual cast of characters, architects, designers, and so forth. So as I was saying, thinking about a drawing of Torquaces like this on the right, for me, starts to conjure ideas again of these sort of larger territories that we then began to think about for our practice. So kind of emanating out of Harlem, we began to look further afield and define this kind of Harlem as the southern tip of this larger expanded geography, which includes the Hudson Valley, which is a sort of large expanse of territory, that is really anywhere between New York and Albany. And I say here, in moving that work on the Harlem African Burial Ground event, which now has become a kind of advocacy project for our office, began to create linkages, as I was saying, to other related sites in that expanded territory. So this is, in parallel with other projects and research that we began to do and have begun to do in the Hudson Valley. There's this kind of linkage being created between some of these other projects and some of these other interests. So this is a project, another African burial ground site in the city of Kingston that I became aware of kind of through other work, unrelated work that we were doing in the Hudson Valley, but realized that it was a similar cast of characters, Dutch Reformed Church, a kind of descendant community, an erased, sort of willfully forgotten site. This is Kingston here. It's a small city, about 30,000 people, very different context than Harlem. But in this case, the issue of territory really is now operating at the scale of the neighborhood. So you have, it really provokes also, questions, even because the site in this small town of this African burial ground is in the backyards of a kind of prototypical residential suburban semi-urban neighborhood. So this historic map shows how the discovery or the rediscovery or acknowledgement of that burial ground site might begin again to unlock and provoke new ideas of kind of communal ownership, stewardship of this site, non-traditional sort of negotiating of territory, this time in a residential context. And this is just a sonogram map of that burial site, a part of that burial site within that context. So here, you know, I decided to put on another studio in academia, in this case, but working with the stakeholders of Kingston to sort of look at how do these issues open up a new imaginary of, again, negotiated territory, collective ownership, et cetera, and involving the local stakeholders, in this case, a land trust and a local Black empowerment group in that effort. This is just another student project. But these things then kind of really are really all kind of part of a larger practice. So, you know, then, you know, my office is now involved with these sort of local stakeholders in kind of the undesign of this first piece of the house that sits on top of that burial ground site. So this is an image of that property, and they're now in the process of kind of renovating it, thinking about, you know, what to do with this architecture in this context. And so, you know, moving these ideas to a slightly different scale and a slightly different place. This is another site in the Hudson Valley that we've been working in, of Newburgh, New York. But again, a kind of like handoff with some similar context. And so Newburgh, I'm going to talk about a project at a different scale, another speculative self-initiated project. But it came out of an investment in this city. It's a small urban center about an hour north of Harlem. And, you know, really Newburgh has some of the problems of much larger sort of post-industrial, post-crack epidemic cities. So you can see here a kind of large, low-income, African-American, recent immigrant population. And in Newburgh, you have this condition, it's about 40 minutes from Kingston. You have this condition where on one block, you might have one family own all of the properties or several of the homes. You might have an out-of-city landlord owning several of the properties. So you have this strange condition that we started to look a little bit closer into just with this quick project, which we called backlots urbanism. And we were thinking about the sort of linkages between some of these different properties that exist on the same block and the back of the lot in general as a kind of untapped territory that could potentially become a local infrastructure or platform for community economy, for food, for dining, and just public space. So we kind of envisioned that you could have a sort of infrastructure or platform kind of built in the back of these lots that kind of piggybacks off of really the latent collective ownership that's sort of permeating in a place like Newburgh. And, you know, as it would turn out, several different worlds converged. And sometimes when you do these sort of speculative projects as a young office and you put yourself out there, if you do it enough, you start to get traction. So we've started to get real projects in the Hudson Valley. And in this case, this is actually a project with Torkwase Dyson for her studio. And so the artist, you know, purchased multiple properties in this case, which in a way starts to almost mirror some of these earlier studies that we were doing of what does it mean to kind of start to articulate a geography within a sort of local territory and operate at that scale. So, you know, the first project is really focusing in on an existing factory building. And these are just kind of early work in progress images. It's a project that started last year. It's been complicated by COVID, to say the least. But again, this is really an exercise for her of, you know, designing and articulating and retrofitting her own environment. So we're turning this existing factory building, auto mechanic shop into a studio workspace for the artist. And these are just a few of those images of that work in progress. To pick up the pace. Am I doing okay on time, Jennifer?
Yeah, I think we're okay.
Okay, great. Okay, great. So as you can see, I sort of show this kind of, geographic diagram of the various areas of our field that I'm operating within. But again, I really consider more and more the sort of blurriness between these boundaries as one practice. And I don't think that blurring the walls, let's say, between non-credentialed community members and sort of credentialed or on the path to becoming credentialed architects is somehow detrimental to the institution, right? So this is just looking at a kind of the different sorts of production, which I feel are really productive for me to move between to articulate a practice, because they, some research might actually begin to engage people on the ground, and then their language for what they're dealing with feeds back into our disciplinarity, frankly. And I want to give a shout out here in particular to Dark Matter University, which is kind of one of these sort of emergent projects out of really kind of thinking about these sort of blurry boundaries, these blurry territories that a lot of us now exist within at the click of a button, that Jennifer is also involved with. So over the summer, and so really Dark Matter University, as some of you may have heard, was kind of leveraging some of this towards the creation of a third institutional space, which really was kind of harnessing some of the blurring, as I was saying, of these institutional boundaries brought on by not only the pragmatic reality of the fact that we're all on Zoom due to COVID-19, but also the increasing urgency of the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery. And we asked ourselves, this was multiple constituencies beginning to come together, having parallel conversations about institutionality, academia, and pipeline to the profession issues that affect BIPOC students disproportionately, and haven't really changed all that much. And we were really asking ourselves, how could we create maybe a third space that not only productively operates in between these different institutions, but also is its own space where we can build new forms of knowledge together as BIPOC bodies in a transdisciplinary kind of paradigm that's also sort of trans-institutional at its inception. So you guys can check that out. That's kind of hot off the presses. But again, maybe not as literally, though I think there's a lot of literal geography involved in the sort of emergence of something like this. The fact that we are able to collapse geography in the space of Zoom, but more kind of disciplinary geography of what happens when you bring different students, maybe from an HBCU, into the space of students from an Ivy League university, and kind of create a different container or sort of augment the container by which we learn, which has already happened. So some of the kind of ambition of this project is to create new forms of knowledge production, new forms of institutions and power, new forms of collectivity and practice, of community and culture, and of course, new forms of design. And this is just a clip from one of the sort of modules that myself and a few others, including Jennifer, have been participating in, really in this very emergent kind of collaborative paradigm that I haven't really done something like this before. And, I'm going to talk about a couple more projects as I kind of bring us through the end here that, are kind of underscored, like Dark Matter University, by the fact that we're really kind of, COVID and Black Lives Matter have really sort of changed everything, frankly. They've changed a lot in New York. And these issues of things like public space have taken on this entirely new dimension with the arrival of COVID and of the Black Lives Matter kind of uprising. Where, at one point you have a city where I've been living in New York, which is like completely vacated by COVID, but then rapidly completely transformed into a sort of different kind of pedestrian environment. So these two things happened right back to one another. And they tap into some latent interest that, a lot of us have been working on, including in my office. So these are images from a little project that we did about public space called Props for Pops. Again, operating at the scale of the city. Pops are called privately owned public spaces. And they're really these leftover spaces that we were identifying in Midtown and elsewhere that are kind of these gift back to the community to create these large commercial skyscrapers, but they don't typically work urbanistically. And they just kind of underscore the fragmentation of that pedestrian environment and the sort of inhumanity of the pedestrian environment. So some of them are okay, but many are sort of these fragments, these islands of public space that are not even public space. They're privately owned. So you have just a litany of issues, which again, we're seeing completely transform or transform a lot. And our practice is now involved with, in this case, local artists in the Bronx and restaurants in this reclaiming of the territory of the street by restaurants. Now it's been expanded to retail. Any retail establishment has been really given this sort of real estate in the middle of the street over to sort of do whatever they want as long as it fits within a certain set of design guidelines. So this project, in a way, preempted that, where we were cataloging and looking at all of these different privately owned public spaces, and then sort of rhetorically stitching them all together to create this almost Piranesian space that it was really a new imaginary for this fluid pedestrian environment that could exist without the imposition of the car, et cetera. And it's just so funny that we're literally now seeing this kind of happen with Black Lives Matter and with the open streets impetus. And so I'll kind of end with a little bit more of a deep dive into a recent project that Jennifer mentioned, which was a competition we won last year, that I think brings together at the sort of domestic multi-unit housing scale a lot of these themes and interests that I've kind of been tracking over the last several years. This project is called Side by Side, and the call was for sort of creative responses to the issue of accessibility in architecture. And we proposed this multi-abled, multi-generational, multi-unit housing prototype. And I think, I bring this slide because we really sort of approach this looking fairly broadly at the issue of accessibility as kind of intersectional with a lot of these issues of human rights that we're becoming more, I think, well equipped to talk about in architecture in a sophisticated way. And how, thinking about accessibility, not to dilute some of the very specific issues that face individuals with accessibility challenges in the urban environment, mobility challenges, but to look at it from a systemic standpoint. And I think that's the difference. And to not other those communities, but to understand that the issues facing those communities are part of a systemic problem that we are also enmeshed in. And in this case, that includes isolation and social isolation in general, which again, we've seen now just amplified with COVID-19. But we were really looking at the kind of recent legislation proposals like the Green New Deal, and that housing is really named as a kind of human right. Architecture enters into these demands that are being raised by major activist groups, not architects. So our sort of this typology even is being really brought into the kind of discussion. And it's not, again, it's not separated from the issue of COVID-19. A lot of the challenges facing communities of color that came up in COVID-19 had to do with space, had to do with access to sort of open space, crowding, care networks in the home. A lot of this is sort of related to some of these issues that we were looking at in this project. And then finally, as if we couldn't make it even more difficult for ourselves, we were thinking about this issue of accessibility of art discipline and the inaccessibility of architects' representation and language and kind of professionalism that can sort of create this othering when we sort of present our work to and produce our work within different contexts. So this project was in a slightly different territory. It was proposed and put on by Cleveland, Ohio, and a set of stakeholders there. And full disclosure, it caught our attention because I'm originally from Akron, Ohio, which is about 30 minutes south of Cleveland. But we also really believed in the sort of prompt, and we don't enter a ton of competitions, a lot of free work. But this one caught our eye. It also caught our eye because the city in question, the neighborhood of Old Brooklyn, which was the sort of site for these proposals, was not too unlike some of these other territories which we've been trying to expand into in terms of the scale and type of community that don't typically see the sort of cool young New York firms design attention. So this is, again, a kind of standard medium density urban environment, mixed racial environment, mixed income, not unlike Newburgh, which I showed before, but a little bit better, doing a little bit better financially and historically. And so we were given this list of sites, which we thought was very interesting to propose for this competition. And, again, thinking about these issues of territory, we were sort of drawn immediately to this kind of double lot in the top left corner, and began to think about, okay, well, competition isn't super clear about what you can do, but we might bend the rules here. You can see here in this very early study model, what was a kind of single house proposition started to grow into a sort of double house proposition, which eventually became the proposal. That you see the small model here, and looking at it from this scale, the kind of site scale, really the strategy for this project, began to we really wanted to challenge, coming from some of these long interests in our practice, some of these preconceived expectations of the single lot or territory, right? And so the urban concept of the project really took these 3 adjacent lots, including one that wasn't even up for grabs. We just wanted to kind of bring it into the composition, you could say, and conceived of them as one single territory, and all of the kind of productive thinking that might engender, and then decided to sort of locate the public zone, a kind of transitional space between these 2 buildings, right on that setback line that you're not supposed to build anything on. But we thought, you know what, the city owns these 2 lots, they're foreclosed. Let's maybe try to sort of agitate the rules here and maybe get a variance or something, because it's really conceptually important. And then in doing that, and shifting the math of these 2 fairly vernacular forms, allow for the kind of creation of this expanded front public yard, and then a more secluded backyard for the project. So again, a kind of micro community is then encouraged at this site, where that kind of front yard, which is even sort of maybe temporarily leasing from the neighbor's property, becomes a kind of expanded public amenity. And then at the scale of the house itself, obviously becomes this sort of intricate negotiating of many territories and many different units, beginning with a sort of shared kitchen at the bottom level, and then progressing up through the house with where that public zone, which starts off as a kind of narrow piece of infrastructure at the basement level, slowly expands to become a kind of collective roof garden at the top. So this again was, we used this large, it was a pain in the ass to make it, but didactic model to kind of produce our representation and kind of make knowable these spaces for the community. And as I was saying, the kind of centerpiece of this design was a sort of this kind of double lift that goes up through that transitional zone and sort of stitches together the project, creating this kind of liminal space, not unlike certain famous precedents in architectural history, like the Maison Bordeaux here by OMA Rem Koolhaas. But I think importantly, we were definitely looking at this project as a very interesting work in the kind of the existing canon of sort of accessibility in architecture. But this is a house for a single occupant who's extremely wealthy, right? So how do we begin to kind of think about these issues at, you know, the scale of and the economies of a kind of community scale? So we, you know, I can't go too into it, but we really looked at this issue of accessibility and social isolation at the scale of the region, kind of collapsing that down, pulling a sort of nearby bus stop and suggesting maybe the bus stops here now. Again, bringing amenities to the kind of micro community of this site. And then taking things like the sort of often these codes of the American Disability Act, which has an amazing story that I just learned of recently of how that came to be. But we always complain about these codes as architects, and oftentimes these features become a kind of an afterthought onto the sort of architecture capital A. And we really tried to sort of kind of embody and not look at these things as a constraint. So taking the kind of length of the ramp that is necessitated for someone to easily access, someone in a wheelchair, becomes this kind of long, lovely garden space that anybody can enjoy in the house. And so this is the sort of full composition now. Those 3 lots are really conceived of as a sort of single territory. And you can see that sort of public zone, that public amenity kind of feeding into the house. And these are just some shots looking at the floor plans, moving up through the house of that basement common area. And then thinking about how to interweave both family units and kind of common spaces at the ground level. And then that becomes an even more intricate sort of negotiation, you could say, of, again, 1-bedroom units, outdoor common space, and then more family units. And so again, the side-by-side title of the project is really thinking about the different kind of even care networks that could function and be sort of promoted by a project like this. So you might have a young college student who doesn't have mobility issues live in this place, and their rent might be subsidized or completely free if the Green New Deal passes. To assist, you know, an elderly resident with cooking their meals, or to just check in on them. So again, something like COVID puts an added layer onto this, where, you know, now we've been talking and we're starting to sort of take the next steps into hopefully building this project. How could this project, which contains things like outdoor public space within the kind of immediate territory of the house, zones here in yellow, these are kitchenettes off of the main elevator core, but they're kind of semi-public breakout spaces. How could this maybe offer a new kind of quarantine or sort of health sort of layout or model that might be usable as a different kind of quarantine cluster, or again, like in-home health sort of stewardship architecture? And so here at the top, you know, the project really opens up and becomes a kind of collective roof garden at the top. And this is just an overview of the whole project. and some images there. I'm way over time now.
You are. So, but that's okay.
Yeah, I can end it there. I can end it. I mean, I really just am ending with, you know, a kind of reflection on our office, of the building we work in, even as a sort of territory that is evolving right now in COVID and that we've been involved in. I wanted to show you guys more like real architecture, the sort of ongoing construction of that space, of the many communities within our own building, kind of working in that construction site as we speak. Actually, though, this was the first phase that we did a couple years ago. And that, you know, the space, the geography that one kind of occupies has really, even our studio space has really been this kind of multimodal space of stakeholders, of different community events, of different co-producers. And now we're into a new paradigm. So we don't know where this is all going to go. All right, I'll talk your ears off.
Oh, this is so fantastic. Thank you so much, Jerome. And I encourage everybody to watch the storefront video. It's a really amazing like window into just the everydayness of how you and Brant are like getting things done. So definitely check that out as well. I'm gonna see if there's, so Jacob said maybe it was a little bit of a slip, but you said, I want to show you real architecture, because I think you have been showing us real architecture.
I know.
But we probably have time for like 4 minutes of questions. If anyone has anything they want to add in the chat, please go for it before we have to break our studio. Oh, Brian, yeah, speak up.
Yeah, I have one question. So I noticed how you were talking a lot about the kind of territories, like looking at these different territories and thinking of these different like sacred spaces and it's like negotiation. And we kind of have like a situation like that right now Minneapolis at 38th in Chicago, where George Floyd was murdered, where a lot of that space has been really used for kind of like healing for people to come together on that corner and really reflect on what happened and kind of bringing the community together. And I was wondering how you think some of the things that you've learned from the burial grounds could be used in a case like this, where it's kind of like those kind of discussions are happening now as people are kind of wanting to open back up the street, but you also have a lot of people that want to keep it as kind of like this like sacred space for people to come.
Right. Yeah. So you said it's a sacred space. Where you mean the site where he was murdered, right?
Yes.
I think a lot of those sorts of conversations came up and have come up in doing some of this work. And I think that it was interesting looking, for example, at even a lot of different African cultures, different traditions around and attitudes around passing on or death or burial. They're not necessarily what we are used to here in the West. And I think, so there was that in terms of, you know, certain practices that we might consider, you know, controversial or against our kind of puritanical American kind of and our American aversion to death are different, are made different when you begin to look at other cultures. I think that's one piece of this. I absolutely think there should be reverence in that sort of situation, but the real reason I think that there's a lot of productive potential to really experimenting in that space and sort of loosening some of our expectations have to do with agency. I think that the agency of something like the memorial for the lynching memorial, it's called the Memorial for Peace and Justice. That project to me is like this hinge point to a new sort of typology that, and a new agency that we have as different bodies and different histories to sort of kind of produce a sort of time-released architecture that affects that is not this kind of feeling that I come and consume of sadness necessarily, and then it's done and it's sort of bracketed, and I go on with my daily life. But rather, I think projects like that begin to sort of imagine the kind of all ever-present potential and unfolding and sort of ongoing agency of something like a memorial, and the ability to maybe think about, what does sacredness mean in the context of everyday life? What would it mean to live on a sacred site, which is frankly how many cultures around the world, they don't separate the sacred from the kind of mundane in the way that we do. So I don't know. I think that we're creating it in real time in situations like that. But I think there's a lot of agency there. Even in, like I mentioned, things like zoning, for the city to say this is now no longer zoned, it's no longer within the sort of language of capital for a site, be it, for racial reparation or what, that starts to like strike at some of the foundational tools of, in this case, urbanism.
Yeah, I love how you describe a kind of a gap being created there, but that it's not as though like time just stops, right? That there's a kind of like continual living. I really loved how you talked about this idea of a living memorial as a kind of like continual overwriting of these like multiple histories of the place.
Right.
If folks have other questions, want to pipe up?
Sorry I went so long.
No, it's okay.
I had to fit in Dark Matter University. I wanted to fit in all this stuff.
You're doing a lot of different things. The thing, I love
man, I'm
seeing,
exhausted.
Yeah, and you're teaching at like how many different schools at one time. But I think one of the things that's so inspiring, I know certainly to me and my own practice, and I hope to students and faculty and staff here, is how you're working at so many different scales and at so many different levels, like scales both kind of physically in terms of, everything from the objects at storefront to the kind of scale of the pavilion to operating at a kind of neighborhood urbanistic scale with the work with Torquasi, but also on these kind of like long time scales too, right? And that like really this effort to kind of, I don't know, unearth these other narratives that exist in a place, and that you're always sort of like mining for that gap in the story. So that's something that I think is really inspiring about your practice, and that you are showing us a lot of strategies for that articulation. Everything from kind of map making that starts to become kind of tactile and like and layered and dense, to like a kind of built object or a collaboration or a process. Mm-hmm. So one last question here. How do you think communities can be empowered to implement the changes they want to see?
I think some of it has to do with expanding our institutional frameworks, to collaborate more with kind of embedded communities and their ancestral knowledge and their expertise, because the machinations of architecture and of developers are often very alienating, and that's by design to community members. So I think, and there's other people working on this. Jermaine Barnes, who I think been here, is coming, talks about the hood architect. But for me, blurring those worlds in strategic ways and bringing people into the same space who, for whatever reason, are rarely in the same space, I think is a start at kind of demystifying what it is that we do, and sort of empowering and legitimizing non-credentialed sort of experts. And I don't think it's to the detriment of our disciplinarity or anything.
Fantastic. Well, I thank you so much for joining us. And
I wish I was there.
I wish you were too, because it would just be really nice to see you and actually give you a hug in person and wine and dine you and all those good things. But thank you so much for yeah, next time, exactly. And thanks everyone for joining us. Oh, I said I would put the link in the chat. I don't think I actually did that in terms of where the recording will be, but that's where it will be. Thanks so much, Jerome. We really appreciate you joining us. It's great.
Thanks for having me. This is a huge honor, and I'm really happy to share my work with you guys. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.